Chapter 10. A snort, followed by a sniff at the door, woke me up and forced me to face yet another day. I rolled my head over to one side to glance at my alarm clock. It hadn't gone off yet. "Go away, Bruno," I yelled at the door, hoping he would listen, but deep down knowing he wouldn't. I reluctantly rolled over on my side and pushed the heap of blankets off me. The bed was built into a small nook with a barrel ceiling. I flipped on the lights that highlighted my surroundings. The slight glow was far less harsh than the bright lights in the rest of the small room. There was a built-in bookshelf in the 3 walls that surrounded the bed, heavily loaded with a variety of books that I stole from Saul's larger library upstairs. I used to love the look of the small nap capsules that Saul had in his storm shelter, but when I slept in them, they always reminded me of coffins. I told Saul this, and he said if I ever died, he was going to put me there and just brick up the entrance. I replied that when he died, I would just have him stuffed and placed in the theater, so I always had someone to watch movies with me. I've since made him promise that if he seals me in my room, he finds it in his heart to wall Bruno up with me, so I had someone to keep me company. Since I arrived here, Saul made sure neither of us ran out of chores, and this made the long days of fun-filled activities bearable. In the off hours, however, there hadn't been much more to do with my time than read and wait for a deer to walk in front of me. The library was our favorite spot in the house, and the grand fireplace was better than any TV. The walls were lined with books, ranging from old classics to newer titles. High shelves, each filled to the max, ensured we could spend all our time in there and never run out of stuff to read. When we weren't working, Lily and I had become inseparable. If anything happened of note, she was the first person I wanted to tell. Often my thoughts ended up lingering on her. I grabbed the first pair of pants I could find and slowly slipped them on, not caring if they were the ones I was wearing yesterday. When I finally got to my feet and walked to the door, I heard the shuffling of paws on the concrete just outside my room. I opened the door. Bruno shot in with all the energy in the world and sailed onto my bed. "Better not pee on it while I'm gone," I warned, pulling my shirt over my head and reaching for my gear. The smell coming from my backpack reminded me I needed to make my way to the washing machine sooner rather than later. As I exited the room, I already heard Bruno's faint snore and wondered how it was he could go from high energy to sleeping in less than 5 minutes. My room was off of a bigger main room that served as the living room for the shelter. The ceiling had a marbleized glow to it from its waxed plaster. I could almost see myself in the reflection as I walked through. The walls were washed with light that came down from ventilation gaps along the ceiling's edge. They were always on, so we never fumbled around trying to find a light switch. Looking at the unnecessary large number of tiny lights that peppered the ceiling, I remembered Saul's motto while building this house: go big or go home. I walked through the big steel double doors that resembled a bank vault, and part of me wondered how this shelter would stand up to a nuclear blast. Knowing Saul, he probably took that into consideration when he built it. Now, however, he very fittingly referred to this part of the house as the dungeon. On my way out, I walked briskly past the storage rooms, like a child walking past a cemetery on a cold night. I hadn't looked in these rooms since I arrived, happy in my ignorance at what was behind the doors. The meals Lily made for me were enough cause for concern. The non-perishables that Saul had stockpiled were fading from the dinner plate and being replaced with more vegetable from the garden. Beef, which was once a staple, was now a special treat. Most often, it was replaced with venison and eggs. I preferred to remember the storage rooms as I initially saw them when they were stuffed with various goods. I couldn't bear the thought of them as lightly stocked as the grocery stores by my apartment when the virus first hit. The more I thought about it, the more I started to realize Lily might be right. Our days here were numbered, if for no other reason than running out of food staples. Suddenly, I felt a sense of urgency, the same one I had when I made the decision to leave the apartment months ago. The feeling we were surrounded by the unknown, forcing us to stay, until we ultimately ran out of food and, most importantly, options. I exited the basement into the garden to go about my daily routine. which started with my walk around the perimeter of the grounds looking for any signs of deer, or possibly a better spot to relocate my nest. I was always trying to increase the odds of stumbling across dinner. I thought about the food situation as I walked to the far side of the grounds to where Saul had his chickens. As usual, I checked to see if there were any wolf prints in the area, always a constant reminder that I wasn't alone in the woods. Occasionally, I even found holes dug around the coop where the wolves had attempted digging, before finding that Saul had completely surrounded the chickens with a deep concrete footing. Saul had once told me about the relationship between him and the wolves. His stubbornness had finally met its equal with the wolves' determination. The coop had gone through many renovations, higher fences, sturdier doors, and other improvements until he came up with the current design. He said he thought the footings to anchor the aviary would be enough to discourage digging, and for the most part it was. However, if the holes weren't filled, the wolves often returned the following night and kept digging in the same spot. Saul solved this problem by assigning the task to me as part of my rent. He had one more job added to my daily chores. Apparently, the presence of easy prey was enough to keep them coming back and ever tormenting Saul in the process. During the winter, the holes rarely got below the snow, the frozen ground being as hard as the concrete. But as soon as spring arrived, these holes became a nightly plague. I got to work filling up the new pits and, as always, wondered if it was the same wolf that Saul was fighting with or the entire population in the surrounding area. Once I was done, I tossed my shovel back into the greenhouse next to all the other gardening tools. As I closed the doors, I looked the place over, as I always try to make sure it was secure. The last thing I wanted to do was try to explain to Saul how the wolves had gotten through a door carelessly left open. As I left, something caught my eye at the peak of the greenhouse. The light glimmered there on what I always assumed was a small spire where the roof panels met. I pulled up my rifle and got a better look through the scope. Another wire sculpture stood atop the greenhouse. From what I could tell, it was slightly larger than the one on the rooftop where I spent my nights. As Saul had said, this one was also completely different. It looked like it was made from copper and portrayed a frozen moment. A girl was struggling to hang on to an umbrella that resembled a sunflower as the wind attempted to pull her off the peak. Yet she balanced there, the effort clearly present in her expressive pose. I hurried back to the house, eager to tell Lily I had found another sculpture. Since getting here, we had found 2 others, making a total of 13 that we knew about. From a distance, I could see a slight glow where I would be spending the night, which meant Lily was already up there. I quickly gathered up my gear, made some coffee, and filled my thermos for the later hours when I was having trouble fighting off sleep. I made my way up the stairs, and when I got there, I found Lily curled up on the patio sofa, reading. I set my rifle down and took the seat next to her. She peeked over the top of her book and said, "I should have been a botanist." From what I could see of the cover, the book had something to do with agriculture. Lately, she had become obsessed with gardening. She tried everything to add to our limited diet and the vast array of flowers she planted. My simple nightly watch post had turned into a floral spectacle with planters lining the parapet wall, each carefully arranged and tended. "I think Saul has a book on every subject imaginable in that library of his. Do you think he's read them all?" "Not a chance," I said, getting comfortable. As soon as I sat down, Lily squirmed her ice-cold feet over to my side. "Yikes! I think you have a circulation problem. It's not natural to always be cold." "Normally Bruno just lies on them, but he's not here, so it's your job." She didn't even lift her eyes off the pages. "Did you know Saul bought a library? Well, maybe not a library, but the books from a library. I asked him how long he had been collecting books, and he told me where he got them all. It turns out there was a library that didn't have enough funding to stay open. I guess people don't read as much as they used to, at least not physical books, so he bought them out, spent a couple days going through what he wanted, then donated the rest to a different library." "That's because he's cheap," I said. "No, it's brilliant. Just because they may have a mark or 2 on them doesn't mean the information is out of date. Really, Vince, buying new books would have been wasteful. I love his timeline. I looked at her with confusion. You know, his timeline, she reiterated. You don't? Have you noticed his spiral staircase in the library? Yeah. Did you ever notice the bookshelf surrounding it is full of history books? That's all. Always the history buff, stuck in the past, I said unenthusiastically. I'm not much of a history fan myself. Oh, really? Remind me again what books you checked out at the library when you wanted to know more about the virus and how it might progress? She shook her head, golden curls cascading around her shoulders. Saul says, the further you look back, the better prepared you'll be for the future. At the bottom of the staircase, the first book is a gray leather-bound Bible. He says that's about the oldest history book around. But as you climb the stairs, books on various civilizations, biographies of notable people in key periods of time, they all gradually get more modern. What's at the top? I asked. That's what I thought was a little weird. A crease formed between her eyes as she concentrated. Another Bible. I've been meaning to ask Saul why. Maybe he just had an extra one and needed a spot to put it, I suggested. No, I don't think that's why, she said thoughtfully. I got the impression from him that his timeline was very important to him. I doubt he just carelessly stacked books anywhere on the shelf. I mean, he did build that staircase specifically for that reason. The only thing at the top is his little reading nook and a well-worn leather chair overlooking the lower levels. I wish the library had been finished when I lived up here. It would have made my schooling a little easier. I finished my senior year up here, I reminisced. Back then, the house was under construction, so all the rooms were empty and unfinished. The library was just a big empty room. Saul had all his stuff in storage containers parked on the land. I always teased Saul for that. Most people have the house first, then move in, not the other way around. So when I wanted to grab a book, I had to dig through boxes first. I did most of my homework by the pond. You know that old Winnebago camper that's parked back there? Yeah? Well, that's where I lived for a summer. It was an old pile of crap back then, even more so than it is now. The house wasn't done yet, and most of the help lived down by the city, so he bought a bunch of old campers for everyone to live in during construction. When we were done, he either sold the campers off or towed them to the junkyard, but not that one. I wonder if it even still runs. We should fix it up, she said excitedly. I mean, when we finally decide to leave. And where would you like to go in that old beater? I asked. You're sure you don't want to just fly or take a train? It had a funny smell back when I lived in it. Probably just downright stinks now. I don't know, we could just start driving and see where we end up. She shifted in her seat. The blankets fell from her shoulders as she sat up straight. Her green eyes shined with excitement at the prospect of leaving. We're always talking about what we're going to do, where we're going to go when this is all done. Why not go somewhere amazing like Yellowstone? I've never been there. Well, if we choose to take the Winnie, then we're not going to make it very far. As I said before, it's very old. We'd be doing good just to make it back home. The thought of home was starting to become a distant memory. I'm afraid Yellowstone may be a bit out of range. Oh, fine. She sank back down in her blankets. Then what do you suggest? I stared into the fire while I thought about it. Well, Lily asked, breaking my concentration. We really don't have any ties anymore, I said. No ties? She looked incredulous. We've been gone for 6 months. Most likely, if things have returned to normal, my apartment is probably rented to someone else and my stuff is sold, thrown out, or in storage. And your place looked a little rough when I passed. We don't really have anything to return to. We could just move on, go anywhere, get a part-time job, and stay as long as we like until we feel like moving on again. That's the thing about not really having anything. You're free to do as you please. No mortgage or bills to tie you down. Free. I turned to look at Lily. She looked hurt, not exactly the reaction I was going for. You mean homeless, she amended. How is that a good thing? That's not what I meant. We can settle down anytime we want. The point is not to rush it. Remember, it's all part of the adventure. I don't think I'm as excited about that idea as you. I'm all for going somewhere, but at some point, I would like to go back home, she said calmly. You know what another word for home is to me? What's that? Sanctuary, she answered. It's a safe place. Somewhere I can be myself, wear pajamas all day. It's a place where the best memories are made. This place is starting to feel like home. But I'm not going to deceive myself. I know this is only temporary. I'll never forget Saul's hospitality. After all, 6 months ago, I was a total stranger to him. When we leave, I would like to travel, but eventually I would like to find another home. That is, if mine is lost. I still like to think mine is waiting for me. I miss the smells, all the unique sounds, and the rest of my clothes. She shuffled in her seat. The clothes Saul had here for me are great, but my own would be nice. The over-the-shoulder boulder holders aren't exactly my size. She caught herself and started to laugh. Oh, I'm sorry, I think I just overshared a little. Do you know, I used to work at a coffee shop not far from my house. It wasn't much, but I liked my job. Working at a place like that, you get to know the regulars, the way they like their coffee or what kind of bagels they like and so on. You know what I miss about it the most? She rubbed her hands together as she waited for a response. Everyone had a story, and they were all different. I loved the endless variation. When they were waiting for me to make their coffee, they often told me about their day, what they had planned, or what they had already done. Every day I got a little more of their stories. Now that all this has happened, I wonder how many of them have written their final chapters, or if I'll ever be back to work to find out. I shook my head. Actually, I think Saul will miss us when we're gone. That old goat pretends to like his isolation, but a quiet house is an empty house. What good is an empty house? Lily asked sweetly. Promise me one thing, though. What's that? I asked curiously. When we leave together. When it's time. After a moment of consideration, I said, Fine. I promise. You swear? I do, I confirmed. No matter what? She smiled thinly. No matter what, I said finally. Okay, that's 3 times, she said excitedly. 3 times for emphasis. Now there is no reason or excuse to break your word. When this is all over, you know what I want more than anything? I asked. What? A big family, I said. Lily looked at me with wide eyes, and for a second I hoped she didn't get the wrong idea. As far back as I can remember, it was just my mom and me. We didn't have anyone else to really share our lives with or lean on when things got tough. Then, when she died, Saul and my aunt were all I had, and they were practically strangers to me. When I die, hopefully not for a long time, I want kids, grandkids, in-laws I can't stand. I think it would be nice to have that option of having a brother-in-law to avoid. I sighed at the thought. You know what we could do? I added. Tell me, Lily exclaimed. Well, we do have a boat. We do, she confirmed, assuming it didn't sink or something. Yes, of course. I continued. We could take said boat and go anywhere in the world. Okay, then what? She asked. You know how you're always cold? Yes. Well, we could sail south to the Caribbean or something. After all, water is all connected. In theory, we could get anywhere in the world in those boats. Sounds great. Then what? We could spend our days on the beach, collecting coconuts, soaking up the sun's rays, anything we want. Perhaps on one of our long walks we'll find a perfect spot with the perfect view, and that's where I'll confess my undying love for you. You will? I will. It'll be great. Then, when I'm done, you'll swoon. I will? Yes, but don't worry, I'll catch you. I wouldn't let you fall even if we were on a beautiful sandy beach. The sand would get all in your hair and stuff. I don't know. I don't swoon that easy, and not just for anyone either. Yeah, but I'll be confessing my love for you. Well, that's one thought, she said. If you learned to cook and made me dinner, that might make me swoon, Lily challenged. Whoa, we're talking hypothetical, right? I said, knowing full well I was incapable of cooking. Of course, she exclaimed, in a tone that said otherwise. Although I do like the idea of heading south, just piling into my little boat and following the coast until we find a little island untouched by disease. She paused just long enough to pull out a world map she used as a bookmark, quickly unfolding it. Here's a good spot. She traced a line down the coast. Plenty of spots to stop along the way and tie up if there's a storm. She continued to study the wrinkled piece of paper, as she had for endless hours before, memorizing every turn of the coast and island close enough to the equator to maintain year-long warm temperatures. I sat and listened to her as she periodically blurted possible destinations. The sun ducked behind the trees, leaving behind a purple and orange sky. Before long, the sunlight faded completely to make way for the stars and the moon's pale light. I think we got cheated, I said, abruptly changing the subject. How so? She asked. We only have one moon, I pointed out as it hung above us. I wish we had a couple more floating around up there. Maybe even a ring system. That wouldn't make any sense. The Earth's design is perfect just the way it is, with the one and only satellite we have. You do know it controls our tides, right? Sure, I agreed. Well, it actually does more than that. It also keeps Earth's stable climate and seasons by controlling the wobble on its axis. But I guess I can see what you're saying. As moons go, it's kind of a boring one. No atmosphere or water, just a big rock in the night sky. I always thought it would be cool if it was more like Saturn's moon, Titan. That moon has its own atmosphere, although very thin, and even oceans. It's a very Earth-like moon. At least then we would have more of a reason to go back there. In the future, that is. Assuming we've been there before. What do you mean, assuming we've been there before? Well, one can't be sure that we have been there. One problem with going to the moon is that to get there, you need to pass through the Van Allen radiation belt. To get through that, you would need excessive protection from the radiation. I saw a special on a probe that was sent to collect data to develop shielding able to travel through it. But if we have already been to the moon, then one could reason that we already had the shielding to do so. If they wanted to go back, they could just fine-tune it is all. But who am I to say? I guess I'm on the fence as far as the moon missions go. Regardless, the one moon we have is necessary and perfect just the way it is. Even the Earth's size, rotation, and gravity are exactly right for life to thrive. It's because of gravity that we have an oxygen-rich environment. If it was any weaker, we wouldn't have the atmosphere that we do. If it was stronger, lighter toxic gases would collect along the surface of the planet and kill us all. Even a toxic atmosphere would make a colony on the moon much more feasible. Any atmosphere at all would help burn up meteors that crash into it. She crinkled her forehead in thought. It's like Einstein said, God does not play dice. Everything is in its right place for a reason. The laws of physics are a constant through the galaxy and didn't happen by chance. They are a brilliant design. But can you imagine what it would be like to live on a moon like Titan? Saturn would dwarf the planet. Imagine what that would look like on the surface of that moon. I stared at her. I was puzzled at her lengthy explanation. What? She said. I read too. Lily shifted in her seat, lowered her head on my shoulder, then sighed contentedly. We stared into the fire, watching the yellow and orange flames devour the small stack of wood. It was hard for me to think of a time before the virus hit. Making the choice to leave my apartment and chance the road up here seemed like a lifetime ago. Before, I was concerned with work, travel, or filling my schedule with friends. Now, my main concern was making sure there was always enough to eat. Often, I wondered what became of my friends back home, or if Dennis had managed to take his own advice and lay low as well. How long would it take for people to fall back into their lives and fill the hours of the day with tasks that seemed trivial now? I thought back to the designer and the fuss he had made over the color of the walls. Did his priorities shift as well? Or was he still concerned with such things? I was reasonably confident in time I would find out how everyone back home fared. Just promise me once more. No matter what, we'll move, she said quietly, as if half asleep. Move where? I asked. Forward. Time seemed to pass quickly when Lily was on the roof with me. It wasn't long before I felt her weight shift, signaling the exact moment she surrendered herself to sleep. A moment later, she started to snore softly. I once informed her of the peculiar noises she made while she slept, only to be called a liar. Yet here we were, and I wished I had my tablet to record her to prove her wrong once and for all. But since it was in my pack on the other side of the garden, getting it would mean waking Lily. With Lily's warmth next to me, it wasn't long before my own eyes started to feel heavy. Every time I blinked, I found it harder to open my eyes back up, until I too drifted off. I'm not sure how long I slept, but when I woke up, she was gone. The fire was reduced to glowing coals, and the night air had an unforgiving bite. As I stretched, I breathed a sigh of relief, glad Saul hadn't caught me. Occasionally, Saul had trouble sleeping and got sick of lying in his bed staring at the ceiling, so he would come check on me. The last time he caught me, he sat down and gave me a little history lesson about Roman soldiers. Any soldiers who were caught sleeping were stripped of their garments and publicly shamed, burned, or beaten, and with good reason. I got the point, but I knew that if he ever caught me sleeping again while I was supposed to be watching over everyone else, I wouldn't get off easy. I shot right to my feet and shook off the sleep. I looked for my water bottle and splashed some water on my face to wake myself up. All Lily's talk about leaving suddenly got me wondering again if the travel restrictions had been lifted. I got out my tablet and wished, as I had done countless times before, that I had an internet connection as I looked at the flu app. The familiar red glow outlining the infected area brought back memories of panic and anxiety as I watched the edge of the red zone get farther away from my apartment. As I had done so many times before, I found my own location on the map. There was a light pink line along the coast closest to us, with a tiny dot of red over the neighboring town. It would only be a matter of time before we were forced to venture out, especially to replenish our food supply. I turned off the app as a hint of that old anxiety started to creep in, with the realization that leaving was inevitable. Suddenly, I felt as though our sanctuary had an expiration date that couldn't be avoided or ignored. Again, my window of opportunity was shrinking. Was it best to leave sooner rather than later, or wait until the very last possible moment? I dug my blankets out of a trunk placed on the roof and made a comfortable area at the edge of the garden and rested my rifle on the ground in my usual spot, facing the water, where deer often visited in the morning. I propped up my book on the spindles so I could see it at a glance and finally reached for my thermos of coffee. I poured myself a cup and sat on the stone parapet wall next to the wire figure that sat on the edge. Looking out over the garden, I tried shaking the thoughts of leaving for now. Of course, we would need to leave eventually. Since when had I become such a shut-in? I sipped at my coffee and shuddered as I realized I was starting to turn into Saul. The ivy hadn't grown high enough on the house to reach the garden. The stone up here was just as it was the day it was set. Back then, the copper gutters gleamed brightly in the sun, but now they were a dull brown that was hardly noticeable. I wondered how long it would be before the copper finally turned green. Each gutter led to a stone head perched at every corner of the roof. at which point they vomited water down to the lower sections before finally reaching the landscaping below. My eyes followed the slope of the wall that circled the thick green maze. The wall was so overgrown with ivy that it almost blended into the rest of the landscape. The ivy had also grown into the stone path at the top of the wall. Anything that wasn't covered in ivy had a thick coat of moss, mostly in the shady part under the stone walkway. I tried to memorize the path through the maze as Saul had. As I traced the tall shrubs, I sipped my coffee and listened to the crickets add to the score of sounds that filled the air. 2 lefts, a right, then another left, I said to myself, committing the twists and turns to memory. No, that's not right. That would just lead back to the statue in the center. It's 1 left followed by 2 rights. The correct path almost led to the entrance, then turned and shot right back to the other side before reaching the exit. I just took another sip of my coffee when I heard something snap, shifting my attention to the woods. Jumping up, I immediately followed the sound and tried to focus in the dim moonlight. I must be getting jumpy, I told myself. Scanning the tree line, I tried to make out anything out of the ordinary. After a while, I finally let out a sigh of relief before another sound caught my attention. The snapping of twigs persisted, as if someone was trying to find his way through the thick forest. I snatched my rifle off the ground and peered through the scope. Whatever it was making a ruckus, smashing through the branches. I scanned the trees for any signs of life and held my breath, restoring the night air to its previous calm. I stood petrified, still looking through the scope as a buck burst through the tree line, snorting excitedly. As it hit the grass, it turned and ran down the hill in the direction of the river, kicking up chunks of dirt as it went. I cursed myself for not shooting it the second I saw it, and started to pace on the roof while I kept my eye on where it had broken through. There was a faint snapping of twigs in the distance, as if something was still moving around. It could be anything, I told myself. Some other small woodland creature, a raccoon maybe. Still, my imagination worked against me, concerned not with the deer, but at what spooked it. I tossed more logs on the glowing embers in the fire pit and poked the coals until the logs caught. It wasn't long before the fire was roaring and casting light onto the parapet wall that surrounded the roof. I sat back down on the edge, this time facing the tree line toward the driveway. Now, incredibly alert, I took in every little detail of sound, trying to pick out different ones and devising what they could be. The crickets resumed their chirping, which drowned out the cracking of twigs that faded into the woods. I tried to push the sound out of my mind, convinced I was jumping at shadows. I began pacing and tried to think of something else, but my curiosity gnawed at the back of my mind like a dog with his favorite bone. Sitting down on the other side of the roof, I checked to see if Lily's light was on, hoping she would join me and get my mind off the woods. But her window was dark, with no signs of movement behind the curtains. Wolves? I wondered. They could have been stalking the deer and spooked it, but most likely they would have continued to chase it and not given up so easy. The crackling branches I heard were a problem, too. Every wolf I'd stumbled across surprised me. They moved through the woods with stealth, leaving only paw prints as evidence they were ever there. Because of the prints I was always finding, I had no doubt in my mind the woods were full of them. But with the exception of the occasional howling, rarely did I ever hear them. Saul had a theory that there must be a den near us. The large population of deer were drawn in by the farms and their crops, as well as Saul's small orchard and chickens. The steady food source kept the deer numbers up, and was one reason hunters were so attracted to this area. But it also meant a steady food source for the wolves. As long as there was food, the wolves would remain close. I started to pace again, with a feeling like I was being watched from afar. I finally couldn't take it anymore. I could use a walk anyway, I told myself as I shouldered my rifle, abandoned my coffee, and darted down the stairs. I was less than careful to keep quiet. The giant front door slammed behind me, and the crunch of the gravel beneath my feet seemed to drown out every other sound as I approached the trampled weeds left behind from the buck. The little light the moon and stars had to offer was of no use to me once I entered the hole in the brush from the buck. I dug a flashlight out of my pocket and soon found the prints left in the soft earth. As I followed the trail, my rifle, still slung on my back, caught and grabbed on every branch I passed, making it tough to navigate. My own feet dug into the soft soil as I got closer to the willow trees. The oak and pine mix stopped abruptly at the line of willows that thrived in the wetlands. During the day, they swayed in the wind and provided shade. But at night, their tumorous, crooked limbs cast unnatural shadows off my flashlight as I followed the deer's tracks back to where I heard the ruckus in the woods. Pushing through the thick tufts of branches, I stumbled onto another set of prints, only this time it was not deer tracks. The prints weren't made from something, but someone. The deer's tracks passed over the footprints, then took off in their own directions. I abandoned the buck's tracks and followed the footprints with a new problem to think about. The woods got increasingly thicker, only giving me a small glimpse of the trail. Behind the breaks in the branches, the house towered over the landscape and blocked out the stars behind it. As I looked back, I saw that the tower where I spent my nights was crowned with a soft glow from the fire I left burning. I realized how much the house stood out and would be easy for a chance wanderer to spot. I stopped and took a moment to wonder just how long people had been watching us from the woods at night, lurking in the shadows and staying out of sight while Saul and Lily slept. Was this a chance encounter? Or was this person studying the house, checking for weak points, a low window or unlocked door to slip into uninvited? I followed the prints until I lost them on the gravel path near the chicken coop. Instinctually, I followed the path away from the house, then stopped noticing footprints around the small building. As I walked, I scanned the woods for signs of life, intruders, wolves, or otherwise, and picked up the pace, nervous at what I might find. I reluctantly acknowledged why Saul had been so insistent on one of us being up and watching at all times. We were not as isolated as I hoped. I had gotten careless in our isolation. I had already forgotten what things were like back when there were stories on the news about desperate people stealing from their neighbors so they wouldn't starve. Just because I hadn't seen anyone in a while didn't mean there wasn't a chance of one of them stumbling on us while in search of food or other supplies. For a moment, I was torn as to what I should do. Get Saul or press on after the intruder? When I noticed prints leading off the path, I abandoned the gravel and headed deeper into the woods. Resting my hand on my rifle as I followed the tracks in the mud, I made an effort to keep my noise to a minimum. A fallen tree had crushed part of the fence that surrounded the property, and I noticed the tracks led right through the small gap created by it. They headed back toward town. Making sure they didn't circle back to the house, I continued to follow them and found that they continued toward the west. I had the sudden urge to turn back now that I knew they led away from the house, but I wondered if they left only to return at a more convenient time. Suddenly, there was a crashing sound in the woods behind me. Twigs broke and snapped as the forest was parted hastily with no effort to conceal the noise. Fearing the worst, I swung around, dropped to one knee, and reached for my rifle. The sound of the branches breaking and the slurping from the muddy ground got louder as whatever it was approached. Moving too fast to be human, I chambered around and aimed, wondering if the wolves had gotten hungry enough to finally take their chances at a lone idiot walking through the woods in the dark. The snapping twigs and footsteps were drowned out by the sound of my own heart pounding in my chest. Grinding my teeth, I resisted the urge to keep my finger on the trigger, and instead flipped the safety off the rifle. In a flash, the branches parted, and Bruno jumped out, panting with excitement and clearly pleased with himself for finding me. "You stupid mutt!" I yelled as I flipped the safety back on the rifle and shouldered it. "You were this close to getting shot, you dolt!" He panted and wagged his tiny nub tail as he sniffed the footprints. He snorted and pawed at the mud as I stood and continued to follow the prints. Frustrated with Bruno, I kept a fast pace, never taking my eyes off the path as Bruno added his own tracks to the mix. through the branches. Thin rays of light hinted at the time of day as we walked, lost the prints, then picked them back up farther down the path. With the ground gradually getting harder, the prints faded as Bruno and I left the willow forest. Bruno periodically disappeared into the woods in search of rabbits, only to return with sticks to chew on until another branch seemed more appealing to him. After a while, I found myself standing on the side of a road, far away from the house. I toyed with the idea of following it for a while, half curious, half afraid I might actually find someone. With the sun starting to warm my back as it peaked above the horizon, I took a step in the direction of town. Immediately, Bruno protested. "Hey, I didn't say you needed to come," I snapped back at him. Bruno paced side to side, but did not follow as I widened the gap between us. "Go back to the house." Pulling the rifle strap tight to keep it from bouncing, I took the first steps in the direction of town, when Bruno let out a sharp bark, followed by a long pause. My curiosity tugged at me to continue down the road, but my better judgment made me consider what I might find. Reluctantly, I turned and headed toward Bruno. Instead of going straight back to the house, I took the long way and circled the property. I wasn't sure what I might find, but I kept an eye on the ground for any evidence of tracks from any other trespassers. My anxiety faded as I made it to the opposite side of Saul's land and didn't find anything. They were gone now. The few structures left standing from the original campground looked unchanged, except for the process of nature slowly reclaiming the land. Weeds choked the entrances to the game room and clubhouse that at one time might have entertained children who had little interest in the great outdoors. After inspecting them, I found the dusty locks on the doors that were still preserving the contents within. Lily at one time suggested that we clean the game room and make it our own little getaway for when we wanted to escape the main house. But it was at the bottom of a large list of priorities that needed to be attended to first. The last time this building had been used was during the construction of the house itself. Back then, it would be alive at night with the sound of laughter and the ping of pinball machines. Even in recent years, when I bumped into guys who worked on this project, they always spoke fondly of the time they spent working on Saul's house, and hoped for a time when a similar project might happen again. As I moved on, Bruno followed behind and sniffed and pawed at the doors as well to be sure they were up to his standards. After a while, I was convinced the area was untouched by outsiders and moved on. With the game room behind me, I headed down the old gravel path through the forest toward the pond. Off the path, the remains of the old tent sites blended in with the towering mix of trees. The only things remaining were the cast-iron fire rings and half-rotted picnic tables. The trees broke slightly, revealing the beginning of a small beach that led into the large pond. Unlike the slime-covered mosquito haven that described most other ponds, this one was fed by a river and had a very rocky bottom. I knelt in the sand next to a white dress and sandals before hearing the faint splashing of Lily, already doing her morning laps. I watched her swim for a moment on the far side, near the layered waterfall. She effortlessly glided through the water. Hints of her trailing golden hair and blue swimsuit were visible in the clear water as she swam through the mist of the small waterfall. Not wanting to disturb her, I picked some forget-me-nots that were growing farther up the beach. I tied the stems together using a blade of grass and turned it into a makeshift bouquet. After placing the bright blue flowers on her dress, I began to finish up my walk with Bruno around the estate. The pond fed a small creek on the opposite side of the beach that continued on into the state land. Crossing it meant barely getting my boots wet. Bruno and I walked in silence through the woods, this time following Lily's path. Closer to the house, the landscape flattened and cleared. The path led through the solar array that powered the house year-round. Smooth black pebbles covered the ground under the endless rows of panels. As I walked, I admired the layout of our own personal power plant. Before long, the towers of the house were visible through the branches of the trees. When I finally exited the forest near the house, I noticed Saul standing on the edge of the garden, peering at me from the wall as he sipped his morning coffee. From the hard look on his face, I could tell he was clearly less than pleased to find me not where I should be. The sun was already high in the sky by the time I ended my lap of the property. I dumped my rifle in my room and continued to go about my chores. I restocked the firewood in the house, cleaned my room, washed my backpack and clothes, and hung them all outside to dry before heading to breakfast. Lily had come back to the house and prepared the usual for us. Idle chit-chat filled the air as we ate, and I resolved to inform Saul about the night's discoveries later, when Lily wasn't present. They talked about the tasks that lay ahead of them while I chewed my toast in silence as I wondered about the condition of the nearby town. After breakfast, I showered, then headed to my little room for some much-needed rest. Not wanting to be pestered, I shut the door on Bruno as he trailed behind me. Despite the fact that I had dozed off earlier, I felt quite tired from my shift, exhausted by all the excitement. As it often did, my mind was fixated on the possibilities of what things were like outside of our little sanctuary. This time I focused on the footprints I had found. Were they made by someone who had lost their way around the woods? Or was someone watching us?